You two, where's the iPad?
What? We didn't steal anything!
Don't lie to me. Empty your bags.
This is crazy! We didn't do it!
Steward Townsend thought he'd finally caught the big one. 2 teens, 2 iPads, and no way out. He didn't just detain them, he humiliated them in front of the whole store. But as the handcuffs clicked, the boy's grandfather walked in. One look at his face, and Steward's career vanished. Who was this man? And why did Walmart just pay $900,000? Join the fight against racial profiling today. Ensure you are subscribed to this channel, like and share this video to spread the message, and tell me in the comment which city you are watching from. Steward Townsend leaned into the monitor in the back office, his eyes fixed on the 2 boys in the electronics department. He didn't see 2 teenagers who had just spent the last 20 minutes asking the sales associate about processing speeds and storage capacity. He didn't care that they had handed over a stack of saved-up 20s and 50s at the register. All Steward saw was the moment Collins and Mike tucked the sleek white iPad boxes into their backpacks. He ignored the fact that the flimsy plastic Walmart bags had started to stretch and tear under the weight of the tech. To Steward, the act of putting merchandise into a personal bag was all the probable cause he needed to satisfy his ego. He watched Collins zip his bag shut, his thumb hovering over the radio button on his belt. He felt that familiar rush of adrenaline, the one he got whenever he thought he was about to catch someone. He didn't check the transaction log on his secondary screen. He didn't call the associate in electronics to ask if a sale had just been completed. He simply pressed the button. Front end, this is Steward. We've got a code 4 headed for the grocery exit. 2 young males, dark hoodies, backpacks. They've got high-ticket electronics concealed. Do not let them pass the sensors, he barked into the radio. He stood up, adjusting his vest, and headed for the door. In his mind, he was already writing the report. He was the guardian of the store's inventory, the man who kept the shrinkage numbers low while other managers looked the other way. As he walked toward the floor, he passed the electronics counter where the associate was still tidying up the area where the boys had been standing. Steward didn't stop to ask questions. He was moving with a singular purpose. He saw Collins and Mike walking toward the exit, laughing and talking about what apps they were going to download first. They looked relaxed. Too relaxed, Steward thought. In his experience, that kind of calm was just a cover for seasoned shoplifters. He picked up his pace, cutting through the pharmacy line to intercept them before they hit the double doors. He wasn't thinking about the law, and he certainly wasn't thinking about the receipts tucked into Collins's front pocket. He was thinking about the win. He reached the vestibule just as the boys were 5 feet from the sensors, stepping directly into their path and holding up a hand to stop them dead in their tracks. The look of confusion on Mike's face only made Steward more certain. He'd seen that look 1,000 times, and to him, it always meant guilt. Steward didn't wait for the boys to reach the sensor line. He stepped directly into their path at the vestibule, his boots squeaking against the polished concrete. He planted his feet wide and crossed his arms over his chest, blocking the only clear path to the parking lot. Collins and Mike stopped short, their sneakers skidding slightly. The air in the small space between the inner and outer doors felt suddenly tight. Steward didn't start with a question or a polite request for a receipt. He looked Collins dead in the eye and said, "I saw what you did back in electronics. Open the bags and hand over the iPads now, and maybe I'll feel like not calling the police today." The boys exchanged a look of pure confusion. Mike started to say something, his voice cracking slightly, but Steward barked over him, telling him to keep his mouth shut. Collins, trying to stay calm the way his grandfather had practiced with them, reached slowly into his pocket. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was reaching for the proof. "Sir, there's a misunderstanding," Collins said, pulling out his phone. "We paid for these. I have the digital receipt right here on my screen, and the paper one is in the bag." He started to extend his arm, tilting the phone screen towards Steward so he could see the Walmart confirmation code and the timestamp from 4 minutes ago. Steward didn't even glance at the screen. Instead of looking at the evidence, he lashed out with his hand, knocking Collins's arm away. The phone fumbled in Collins's grip, nearly hitting the floor. "I don't care about your fakes," Steward snapped, his face reddening. "I know how you kids work. You find an old receipt, or you Photoshop a screenshot to look like a confirmation. It's an old trick, and it doesn't work on me." He stepped closer, invading their personal space until he could smell the peppermint gum Mike was nervously chewing. "You're going to turn around, and you're going to walk to the back of the store into the security office. Now, if you make a scene, I'm adding a charge for resisting." "But we have the paper receipt too," Mike pleaded, his hands trembling as he reached for the zipper of his backpack to show the proof tucked inside the box. Steward lunged forward, grabbing the strap of Mike's bag and jerking him toward the interior of the store. "Don't touch that bag. You don't open anything until we're behind closed doors where the cameras can see every move you make." A few shoppers paused near the cart return, whispering and watching the scene unfold. Steward felt the eyes on him and doubled down, convinced that his public display of authority was justified. He didn't see two kids terrified of being falsely accused. He saw two suspects trying to wiggle out of a trap. He shoved his finger toward the hallway, leading to the back offices. "Move, both of you. Now." Collins looked at Mike, then at the phone in his hand. He realized Steward wasn't interested in the truth. He was interested in a win. Collins tucked his phone back into his pocket, his finger sliding over the side button to trigger his emergency contact. He knew he couldn't fight Steward here, but he knew exactly who could. Steward forced them into the narrow, concrete hallway that smelled of industrial floor cleaner and stale air. Mike's heart was hammering against his ribs, but his hands didn't fail him. He kept his head down, shielding his movements from Steward's aggressive gaze, and slipped his thumb across his phone screen. He didn't dial a number. He hit the speed dial shortcut for George Freeman. He felt the phone vibrate once in his palm, signaling the call had connected. He didn't put it to his ear. He just gripped it tight, the microphone exposed, recording the sound of their sneakers scuffing the floor and Steward's heavy, self-important breathing. Steward was in the middle of a lecture he'd given 100 times to kids who couldn't fight back. "You think you're smart using those backpacks?" Steward sneered, his voice echoing off the cinder block walls. "I see kids like you every day. You think because you've got the latest gear and you act like you belong here, I won't notice when you try to walk out with $900 worth of tech for free. You're just another pair of statistics that I'm clearing off my books today." He reached out, his hand clamping down on Mike's shoulder to steer him toward a heavy steel door marked Loss Prevention. "Don't touch him," Collins said, his voice steady but laced with a warning. Steward laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "I'll touch whoever I need to when I'm protecting this store's property. You're lucky I haven't put you in zip ties yet." Suddenly, a voice cut through the hallway. It wasn't loud, but it had a resonant, practiced authority that stopped Steward's heart for a split second. The sound was coming directly from Mike's hand. "Steward Townsend?" the voice asked. It was deep, calm, and carried the weight of someone used to speaking into microphones in city halls. "This is George Freeman. I suggest you take your hands off my grandsons immediately before this situation becomes a constitutional issue for your employer." Steward froze. He looked down at Mike's hand, finally seeing the phone. The name George Freeman was glowing on the screen. The manager's face transitioned from a flush of anger to a sickly pale gray. He knew that name. Everyone in the city knew that name. George Freeman wasn't just a grandfather. He was the man who sat on the council committee that decided which big box retailers got their zoning renewals and which ones faced community impact audits. "Mr. Freeman," Steward stammered, his grip on Mike's shoulder loosening as if the boy's jacket had suddenly turned into live wire. I have a visual on concealed merchandise. I'm just following protocol." "Your protocol doesn't include physical battery or ignoring proof of purchase, Steward." George's voice continued through the speaker, cold and precise. "My grandsons have their receipts. They have my authorization to be there. And as of 30 seconds ago, I am 5 minutes away from your front door with a deputy from the precinct who is very interested in why you're detaining minors without looking at their documentation. I suggest you stay exactly where you are and keep your mouth shut until I arrive." Steward's hand dropped to his side. The hallway, which had felt like his kingdom just moments ago, now felt like a trap. He looked at the boys, really looked at them, and saw the calm, focused expressions of people who knew exactly how the next hour was going to go. The power in the room hadn't just shifted, it had evaporated from Steward's grasp entirely. The automatic sliding doors hissed open, and George Freeman stepped into the vestibule with a stride that forced people to move out of his way. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a structured wool coat and a look of absolute, focused discipline. He didn't head for the service desk or look for a manager. He walked straight toward the hallway where he saw the cluster of uniforms and his grandson's familiar hoodies. Steward was standing by the cinder block wall, looking small, his hands fidgeting with the radio on his belt. When George stepped between the manager and the boys, the physical space in the hallway seemed to rearrange itself. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply placed a hand on Collins's shoulder, anchored himself, and waited. 2 patrol officers entered the hallway seconds later, their heavy gear clattering. They started to lead with the standard, "All right, what's the problem here?" But the words died in the air as soon as they saw who was standing there. "Councilman Freeman," the lead officer said, his posture straightening instantly. "We didn't know you were involved in this call." "I am the call, Officer Miller," George said, his voice level. "And right now, I'm witnessing a gross misuse of merchant's privilege. My grandsons have been detained and physically handled by Mr. Townsend here, despite having valid proof of purchase for their items." Steward tried to find his voice, stepping forward with a shaky index finger pointed at the backpacks. "They concealed the iPads, Councilman. I watched them on the 4K feed. They put them in the bags and headed for the exit. Protocol says you verify a sale before you touch a minor," George interrupted. He turned back to the officers. "Officer, I want the store's transaction log for the electronics department pulled right now. Not in 10 minutes. Now, I want the timestamp of their purchase compared to the timestamp of when this man stopped them." The manager stammered, trying to explain that only he had the login for the back office terminal, but the officers were already moving. They followed Steward into the small, cramped security booth. The air was hot from the humming server racks. Steward's hands were shaking so badly he mistyped his password twice. Under the watchful eye of the police and the steady, unblinking gaze of George Freeman, the screen finally flickered to the sales records. The data didn't lie. A sale for 2 iPad Pros and 2 Apple Pencils had been finalized at Register 42 in the electronics department at 4:12 p.m. The security footage from the vestibule showed Steward blocking the boys' path at exactly 4:15 p.m. There was a 3-minute gap. In those 3 minutes, the boys had walked directly from the point of sale toward the exit. They hadn't detoured. They hadn't hidden anything. They were simply customers leaving a store with items they owned. 3 minutes, Steward, George said, looking at the glowing red numbers on the monitor. In 3 minutes, you turned a legal transaction into a civil rights violation. You didn't check the register. You didn't check the digital log. You saw 2 black boys, and you skipped the fact-finding part of your job because you thought your gut feeling was the law. The lead officer looked at the screen, then back at Steward, and sighed. He didn't even ask to see the bags anymore. The digital trail was so clean, it was blinding. The officer turned to George. "Councilman, the record is clear. There's no evidence of a crime here. Actually, it looks like the only issue is how they were treated." Steward tried to speak, to offer some kind of corporate apology, but George simply held up a hand. The power shift was complete. The manager was no longer the one asking the questions. He was the one who was going to have to answer them in a courtroom. The legal department at corporate headquarters didn't even try to fight. When the file landed on the senior counsel's desk, it contained the 4:12 p.m. receipt, the 4:15 p.m. footage of the confrontation, and a recorded statement from a city councilman who also happened to be the boy's grandfather. There was no gray area to exploit. Steward had skipped every mandatory step of the general protection guidelines. He hadn't maintained unbroken surveillance, he hadn't confirmed the merchandise wasn't paid for, and he had initiated physical contact without a weapon or an immediate threat being present. By the time the internal audit was finished 48 hours later, the company's risk management team knew they weren't just looking at a shoplifting mistake. They were looking at a textbook case of false imprisonment and a massive civil rights liability. Steward was called into the regional manager's office on a Tuesday morning. He expected a reprimand or a temporary suspension while things blew over. Instead, he found a human resources representative and a security guard waiting for him. They didn't offer him a seat. They handed him a termination notice that cited gross negligence and a fundamental violation of civil rights policy. Because the incident involved the detention of minors and documented physical aggression, the termination was coded as ineligible for rehire across the entire global network. His career in retail management, built over a decade, ended in less than 3 minutes of conversation. As he was being escorted out the back employee entrance, the same way he had forced so many others out, he saw the Help Wanted sign on the front window. He knew that with this on his record, no background check in the state would ever clear him for a position of authority again. The settlement was handled with quiet, clinical efficiency. The The company offered $900,000 to avoid a public jury trial that would have dominated the local news cycle for months. George Freeman ensured the funds were structured properly. After legal fees, the money was placed into high-yield educational trusts for Collins and Mike. It was enough to cover 4 years at any university in the country, room and board included, with enough left over to give them a significant head start on their adult lives. But the money wasn't the point for George. The point was the consent decree he forced the store to sign, which mandated a complete overhaul of how probable cause was determined in every location across the district. A few months later, Collins and Mike were back in school, the iPads they had rightfully bought sitting on their desks. The incident had left a mark, a lingering habit of checking for their receipts 3 or 4 times before leaving a store, but they had seen the system actually work for once. They had seen that a hunch wasn't a law, and that an ego wasn't a badge. Steward Townsend was gone, reportedly working a night shift warehouse job where he didn't have to interact with the public or manage a single person. He had learned the hardest lesson a manager can learn, that his prejudice carried a specific price tag, and that day, it had cost nearly $1 million. Let's pull back the curtain on this for a second and look at what actually happened in that hallway. Steward Townsend didn't just make a mistake. He fell victim to a psychological trap called cognitive dissonance. From the moment he saw Collins and Mike on those monitors, his brain had already written the ending of the story. He decided they were thieves. When Collins tried to show him the receipt, Steward's mind literally couldn't process the information because it contradicted the truth he had already created. To accept that receipt would have meant admitting his own judgment was flawed, and for a man like Steward, his ego wouldn't allow that. So, he did what many people do when faced with facts that challenge their bias. He ignored them and became more aggressive. This story isn't just about one bad manager in one store. It's a case study in what we call systemic liability. In the legal world, there is something called merchant's privilege. It gives a store the right to detain someone, but only if they have probable cause. Probable cause isn't a feeling or a vibe. It's a set of facts, like seeing someone physically conceal an item and fail to pay for it. The second steward ignored the receipt and the sales log. He stepped outside the protection of the law. He wasn't acting as a manager anymore. He was acting as an individual with a grudge. George Freeman didn't win this case just because he had political power. He won because he understood that in a court of law, documented facts will always crush a personal narrative. Steward thought his title as manager put him above the evidence, and that's a $900,000 mistake that any company will eventually have to pay for. The takeaway here is straightforward. Choose evidence over ego every single time. If you're a customer, your digital and physical receipts are your armor. Keep them accessible and remain calm, because the moment you react with the same aggression as the person accusing you, the narrative starts to shift. But if you stay composed and stick to the facts, you maintain the high ground. If you're a manager or an employee, remember that a hunch has zero value in a courtroom. We live in an era of 24/7 surveillance, instant cloud-synced recordings, and immediate digital paper trails. The truth is usually just a few clicks away on a computer screen. For Steward Townsend, ignoring those clicks cost him his career and cost his employer nearly $1 million. It's a reminder to everyone in a position of power. Don't let your personal bias write a check that your professional future can't possibly cash. Facts don't care about your gut feeling, and the law definitely doesn't either. Steward Townsend walked out of those sliding doors for the last time with nothing but his personal keys and a bruised ego. He didn't just lose a job, he lost the power he used as a weapon. Meanwhile, Collins and Mike used their settlement to secure their futures, turning a moment of humiliation into a legacy of opportunity. George Freeman made sure the store's new evidence-first policy was etched into their training manual, ensuring no other kid would have to prove their worth against a manager's hunch. This story reminds us that while bias is free, the consequences are expensive. Justice isn't just about the payout, it's about forcing the truth into the light. If you believe that accountability matters and stories like this need to be told, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're dedicated to bringing you the most compelling, real-world dramatizations and the lessons they teach us. Don't forget to like this video. It helps the algorithm spread the message of justice. See you in the next one.